So after today's class on Confucius and Mencius, we have 3 remaining classes in the semester. As you will have observed, there are no assigned readings for those last 3 classes, as you will be writing your papers, your responses to the argument of the course. In next week's class, Michael Pewitt will again lead a discussion on the general theme of the history of Chinese philosophy, especially as it pertains to our subject of the conduct of life, compared to the history of Western philosophy with the same focus. Then in our next to the last class, we will return to the themes of the first class. The role of the mind in the development and the choice of these contrasting projects of the conduct of life that we have explored throughout the semester. The problem of justification, the extent to which these projects are blind wagers, or on the contrary, alternatives on which the mind can cast light. And then the final class will be open for discussion and will be then the conclusion of our all too brief semester. Michael.
Great. So last week, we discussed Buddhism, and we asked you to take it seriously. Not necessarily to agree with it, but rather to take it seriously in the sense of trying to understand what these teachings were about, what they were calling on us to do, when, as we noticed immediately was the case, they challenged some of our fundamental assumptions to allow that to occur, and allow at least the possibility that these are onto something, and that perhaps some of our assumptions should be challenged. And if we want to stick with our assumptions at the end, at the minimum, we would have to reconstruct them, having taken this challenge seriously. Now, we will do the same today in looking at Confucianism. But let's be honest, many of you may be thinking, having looked at the Analects, or perhaps, and relatedly so, because the first glance of the Analects kind of leads to this, having heard various stereotypes about Confucianism, you might think, well, that's a lofty goal to take ideas seriously, but it's going to be rather tough in this case. Because, on the contrary, we seem to be dealing with a set of teachings that, well, humanity has wrestled with, and thankfully, many of us might think, moved beyond. And so let's just lay out some of these reasons that many of us may initially think it's going to be more difficult to take these ideas seriously. And let's begin with the most obvious. We are dealing with someone, Confucius, who is absolutely committed to the importance of, among many other things, but he is absolutely committed to this, ritual. And let's talk a bit about ritual. Let's talk a little bit about why many of us would think ritual is an intriguing historical artifact, maybe worth taking seriously in the limited sense of trying to understand how many human beings throughout their lives have lived their lives, but why we would perhaps not think it's something we could take terribly seriously. And let's, again, just lay some of these out on the table. So what are common assumptions that we like to make? Kind of the, let's call them, everyday ways of speaking about the philosophical ideas we've been exploring. So if you're looking at philosophical ideas aimed at explorations of the will and the ways in which the individual will can act upon and alter the world, the kind of American way of speaking about this uses terminology, you can trace the genealogy coming from notions of the will, along the following lines. How should we live our lives? Well, we should look within. We should look within and find ourselves, find our true self, exactly as we were discussing last week and then critiquing. And if we find our true selves, we should live our lives according to what is best for us, according to what really makes us as a human being tick. And the reason that things like ritual, I think, kind of gnaws at us in a very negative sense is because we associate ritual with traditional societies, right? Traditional societies in which You actually were born into a world where you had to do rituals. The rituals told you what to do, in other words, instead of we choosing for ourselves what to do. Rituals trained you into a way of being, as opposed to, again, our deciding for ourselves. And we tend to associate rituals, therefore, with traditional worlds in which you're born into a society, you do rituals that socialize you into a certain way of thinking, a certain way of behaving, a certain social position in life. Everything that we like to think the modern world has finally and correctly rejected. And so when we read statements in the Analects like, and this is a literal quotation attributed to Confucius, the way to become humane is to overcome, a better translation would be to conquer, ke, for those of you who know Chinese, to overcome or conquer the self by submitting yourself to ritual. There are a few statements, perhaps, that would more cut against our assumptions about the way to live a good life. And so you might think, again, if we're going to ask you to take ideas seriously, well, this is going to be a tough one. That, nonetheless, is going to be my goal. I'm going to argue that, yes, we should take these ideas seriously. They most certainly will challenge some of our fundamental assumptions, to put it very mildly. And if that is the case, and again, I suspect we'll find very quickly it is the case, good. One of the goals of a class like this is to force us to question assumptions we take for granted, so that at the minimum, they will no longer be assumptions, but things we would have to argue for, as against other positions that we realize have tremendous philosophical depth. There is a reason that figures for 2,000 years have been exploring and working with and living their lives according to the teachings of figures like Confucius. So, with that as an introduction of my goal in these opening remarks, let us, as last week, go back 2,000 years, or about 2,500 years. Go back to the period where we began last week's lecture as well. We mentioned you've had about 2,000 years of the Bronze Age, societies in which, indeed, all social positions were gained almost exclusively through birth, in which there was almost no social mobility of any kind, and in which the major religions of the day very much assumed and supported such a rigidly hierarchical, birth-based system. We also mentioned last week all of these Bronze Age kingdoms, all of them, fall apart over the course of the first millennium BCE, leading to an extraordinary sense of cultural crisis, as well as an extraordinary period of political experimentation, and, again, most importantly for the concerns of this class, extraordinary philosophical and religious experimentation. Religious movements, philosophical movements, but again, not in the academic sense, trying to rethink how humans should live their lives and how we could actually create great worlds for ourselves and for those to come. We've mentioned the differences. We mentioned briefly what was happening in Greece. We mentioned last week what was happening in India. Today, we turn to China, where the exact same thing is going on. And yes, as we will see, Confucius is, in this sense, an axial age thinker. He does not want us to simply stay in the place we are born. He thinks the world he is born into is horrible, and he wants to change it. But he has radically different views of how that change should occur than what we were seeing last week, and certainly as well what we see in Greece. So let's explore his views. And, as with the Buddha, let's begin with Confucius, because the story of his life is going to be an important part of the tradition. So, Confucius is born at a period when all the larger phenomena we've been discussing as pan-Eurasian were certainly being clear, although obviously not seen in a pan-Eurasian context. And what I mean by that is the following. In China, you had a series, in fact, there were 3 of them, of enormous Bronze Age dynastic systems that had dominated the North China plain for, by now, close to 2 millennia. The last one was called the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhou dynasty, when it began to decline, instead of being replaced by yet another Bronze Age dynasty, on the contrary, began to decline in the midst of all the transformations we were discussing last week. The Iron Age begins. population explosions begin. Cities begin growing. Trade begins growing. Social mobility, relatively speaking, for the first time, begins to at least become possible. Mass infantry armies start being organized. And the entire Bronze Age world slowly begins to fall apart. Confucius is born into this period. He sees a world around him of utter chaos, of increasingly states now becoming independent states, creating these mass infantry armies, gearing themselves for war, and he desperately wants to change this world. He tries to change it at first by doing so politically. He is born into sort of right below the aristocracy, and so he is born into a group that's going to become of prominence in the centuries to come, born below the aristocracy, but because they can become literate, potentially able to join these states, potentially able to even gain ministerial positions in these states, and potentially able to alter them. And he is one of these. He becomes literate. He begins seeking positions. He actually gains some relatively low-level but significant positions in the sense of hopefully leading toward more. And he begins moving up, and he's ultimately blocked, and has a relatively successful career, but not achieving the kinds of levels that he had been hoping to. And so he then retires and decides to start changing the world in a different way. He becomes a teacher for that next generation of people, like himself, for the most part born below the aristocracy, hoping to become literate, hoping to gain positions in these growing states, and hoping thereby to change the world. Only Confucius, unlike many teachers of his day, isn't just trying to teach them to read, write, argue policy effectively. He wants them to change the world in a deeper sense, too. And he begins educating them about how to do so. And then he dies. As far as we know, he wrote little. There is a text, one, that's attributed to him, a very brief chronicle of the tiny state of Lu he lived in. Otherwise, he wrote nothing. What we know of his teachings comes from his disciples and the stories they told about him. His disciples, after death, begin writing down the statements he made to them. And those are then collected into the text that we read for this week, or one of the two, called the Analects, which purports to give us the words Confucius spoke to his disciples. Now, I mentioned in passing at the beginning of my talk that some of the stereotypes that we may have about Confucianism, which I will be arguing are wrong, some of them might have even hit you upon a quick first glance of this text. Because, indeed, this is a text that talks a lot about rituals. It talks a lot about the rituals Confucius did. In fact, we learn a ton in chapter 10 in particular about all the daily activities that he undertakes, and we hear about them in great detail. We also, indeed, get lots of statements that he makes to his disciples, but they might not have struck you as grand philosophical statements, to put it mildly. In fact, let me make that point more strongly. When people give quotations from Confucius, you might have noticed when you perhaps for the first time were reading the Analects all the way through, that the few quotations that have sort of become commonly attributed to Confucius are those few where he seems to make grand philosophical statements. They're rare. Most of the statements, at first glance, seem kind of mundane. They're often exceedingly brief, made to specific disciples in specific situations. We often get very little of that situation in the text itself. And it's sort of one passage after another where he's making these brief statements to particular people. Oftentimes, they're self-contradictory. In fact, the text seems to be arranged to emphasize that. So he'll talk a lot about things like humaneness and benevolence. His disciples will ask what you mean by that, and he'll give answers, but they're often different to different disciples in different situations, and they'll be arranged in text. 1, 2, 3, contradiction, contradiction, contradiction. And so you might at first glance have thought, This is a text that doesn't really seem to be philosophical in the sense that we tend to use the word. It doesn't seem to involve the kind of groundbreaking visions, deeply challenging visions that we were discussing last week. And yeah, it sure is very concerned with things like ritual. And so you might have thought something about those stereotypes may be onto something. Well, no. I think not. Or rather, yes, in the ritual sense, but not in the sense that he means by ritual what I think we mean by ritual. So let me try to take you into what I think is really going on in this text. In doing so, I will pull from some slightly later materials and using the actual terms used to give you a sense of the moral psychology, and if this is the proper term, it's ultimately not going to be, larger worldview of the text, and then discuss its implications and why people have been wrestling with this text for so long. If you were surprised that, when you read it, that this is considered one of the great philosophical texts in world history, I'm going to argue there's a very good reason it's considered one of the great philosophical texts in world history. And even the seemingly difficult way it's written, with these just pithy statements, one after another, often contradictory, there's a reason it's written that way. And to take it seriously, we have to understand why. So let me make an argument as to what I think is going on. And to do so, let me pull from a text written probably about a century and a half after Confucius, but clearly based upon these same sets of ideas. And I'll even use a lot of the Chinese terms in translation, but to give you a sense of the flavor of the argumentation that I think you will see how we should rethink ritual. I'll put it mildly at first and make more dramatic statements momentarily. So what are human beings like? Do we have this true self that we should be looking within and finding? No. Let me tell you what human beings are like. Human beings are a mess of different stuff. The term I'm translating stuff here, the Chinese, is qi, energies, but energies not in the usual way we use the term. Energies here would be all the basic stuff that makes humans, that literally underlies everything, but particularly with humans. So we have different faculties, we have different potentials, we have different bodies of sort of stuff in us. And it's a really, really, really messy bunch of different stuff. And we're all this messy bunch of stuff. And then what happens to humans very early on is we begin interacting with other messy pieces of junk, other humans. And the way this interaction happens is when we, these two messes, and it's going to get any more than two momentarily, start interacting, we pull out, drag out from each other, would be a closer translation, these different energies from each other. So, some standard examples. Someone smiles at me, I feel happy. In this way of thinking, someone smiles at me, that act drags out from me the energy of happiness. Then someone else yells at me. I get angry. Or in this way of speaking, that act of anger drags out from me an energy of anger. And you can tell right away one of the problems, which is that we as human beings can be totally and purely passive in this. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm jealous, I'm resentful, based upon immediate things happening around me. And I'm simply being dragged out, moment by moment, according to happenstance things around me. Now, let me add, this first piece of bleakness is actually something that many psychologists would say is onto something. So if you talk to people now doing psychological experiments, they will actually say, this characterization, I've discussed it with them at length, is basically right. So they will say, we humans like to think that we have this will and we're deciding for ourselves over a course of a day what to do, and in terms of our lifetimes, how to direct our lives. And in fact, most of what we do is kind of based upon these immediate things around us that happen to us. It affects our moods, that affects how we behave. That will then lead us to do certain things that we later will term a decision. And I decided to do X. It has much more to do with just immediate things around us. So most psychologists will say, this is onto something. But like last week, it's going to get much bleaker. So let me get to the bleaker part. So in the psychology that will be important in Confucianism, all of what I just described, that's right at the beginning. And at least in those examples, those are actual things happening that I'm responding to, right? Someone does smile and someone does yell. And my emotions are at least based upon these things that really do happen. It gets much worse. Because then very soon, I fall into patterns of responses that have nothing to do with actual things going on around me. So someone else will do something that will remind me of an earlier moment when someone smiled at me. It equally drags out from me this energy of happiness. Another person will do something. Again, perfectly pleasant in this case, but it will emotionally remind me of that earlier time when someone yelled at me. It equally drags out from me the energy of anger. And we fall into patterns and ruts in the ways we perceive the world, interact with the world, see those around us, that can literally define us as human beings. We, dangerously, can call this a personality. It's nothing of the sort. It's sets of patterns that we fall into. It will determine how we see, or much more importantly, fail to see the world around us, because we see the world according to what we think we are seeing, according to the patterns we've fallen into. We will build relationships based upon these patterns that have nothing to do, or minimally to do, with the actual people we're interacting with. We are patterned creatures who live our lives by habit. Now, if you think this sounds a little overly bleak, let me just give you a standard example that I'm sure applies to no one in this room, but just in case you have a friend maybe who falls into this. Do you have maybe a friend, no one here I'm sure, a friend who you have seen go through many relationships, and you've kind of noticed they have the same relationship over and over and over again, regardless of who it is they're actually dating? And you can see it happening. You can see, like, first he or she dates, it's going well. Then you can just see it going in. He or she is, X, Y, or Z. Like, no. And you can just see the emotions start coming in. You can start seeing the pattern playing out. And you know exactly how it's going to play out because you've seen it every time. And you can talk to your friend over and over again. Maybe this person you're dating isn't really doing all the things you're now imagining is occurring. It doesn't matter. And they just play it out over and over and over again. Now, I'm sure that's not true of anyone here. No, I'm sure not. But think for a moment of perhaps the possibility that many of your friendships and relationships actually are based much more in patterns than they are really based in who you're interacting with. Imagine, to put it really bleakly, even relationships you think are working out, again, with friends, not yourselves, of course, but with friends, maybe because these patterns are momentarily, for a brief period of time, kind of not too conflictual. So it doesn't mean that people are really relating. It just means the patterns aren't so conflictual it's falling apart. But that can change. And imagine this is what human beings are like. I would also add, if you need more examples, not only are psychologists beginning to realize this even bleaker vision is true, note the degree to which most political analysts, every single figure at Facebook and Google, will say not only is this the case, they have designed their entire political/business models based upon this, because they have found we are so flawlessly predictable that, to move out of politics for a moment to get to the seemingly less scary one, advertising, they have noticed that we are so patterned that they can sell to advertisers the following sets of things. This is not an exaggeration. They will sell to advertisers things like, they know you personally, your last class ends on a Thursday afternoon. At 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, one of the things you do when you're kicking back is you go to a series of websites. They know exactly which websites at what time. They know your eyes tend to be drawn to the color red if it's at 2:37 at the higher end of the computer screen, your eyes are drawn there. They know something there, color red, relates to a piece of, like a pair of pants you bought last week. You will therefore suddenly see a watch that looks really nice with a pair of pants that you bought that's part of the same design of the pattern that you tend to like in general. In red at that spot, it's now 2:38. Click. You say, oh, I decided to buy a watch. No, you're a patterned creature that is so easily manipulated that Google or Facebook, whoever's selling it, they both do the same thing, is able to manipulate you into that click at 2:38. We are that flawlessly and chillingly easily being manipulated. So it's not just that we're like this, we are dangerously easy to manipulate by anyone who can see this. So, let's get back to these nice things we like to say about ourselves. I'll look within. I'll be true to myself, sincere and authentic to who I really am. I will live my life according to the ways I want to live. What if, when you look within and find yourself, what you're finding are a bunch of patterns and ruts and habits that define your life, and then when you say, I'm just going to love myself and embrace myself for who I really am, what if what you're loving and embracing are your patterns and ruts and habits? What if when you say, I will love myself for my good sides and love myself for my bad sides too, because that's just me. What you're saying is, I've fallen into a series of patterns and ruts from a young age, and I'm going to stick with them. I'm going to define them as me. I'm going to claim they're good. I'm not going to change one of them because it's my true self. That's what we're doing. I'm going to keep clicking there as I'm being manipulated to click there because that's just me. That's what we're really saying to ourselves. Now, if, and I think we kind of have to admit, maybe there's something to this, what do? What would we ever do to alter then our lives? To begin the process of being able to construct ourselves and the world around us in a way that would not simply be this passive repetition of patterns all throughout our entire lives? Ritual. Ritual. The thing that we associate as being the bad thing, right? The thing that tells us what to do. From this perspective, it's the precise opposite. Now, let's talk about ritual in the Confucian sense. Ritual in the Confucian sense is not, and this is going to be very important as we lay out the examples, teaching you what to do. You have to submit yourself to ritual, absolutely, but you don't stay there. And what I mean by that is the following. You do ritual because ritual forces you, and it forces you. You must submit yourself to it. It forces you. It forces you for that brief moment to become a slightly different person, interacting with those around you in a slightly different way, forcing you to break out of your standard ways of interacting with those people, forcing you to, in practice, develop different forms of interaction, and then, and this is equally important, forces you to leave and return to your normal life. And the reason you do ritual, no, you don't do it just once, you're doing rituals all the time, is because you're being forced over and over again to enter a ritual space, become a different person, leave again, immediately fall back to your usual patterns, enter again, fall back again, enter another one, fall back again. And the argument is, over time, it's that process, that sort of break that you're doing, back and forth, over and over again, where the work of beginning to alter yourself can start. Let me give you one of their examples before we get to how this ends. But let me give you one of their examples of ritual. So we're dealing with the fall of the Bronze Age world, which was, to put it mildly, about as purely a patriarchal world as you can imagine. So I mentioned all positions are based upon birth. They are also exclusively defined by male lines. How do you begin to break this? And how do you begin to break all of the sort of grotesque emotions and energies and horrors that can come out of such a world? It doesn't take much imagining such a world. We kind of still live in it. How do you begin to change it? Well, here's one of their rituals. Imagine that you are a ruler in that world, which means, for the sake of this example, you're male. You have a son who is also male. And you had a father, also by definition male, who's dead, which is why you're king. It's simply succession. It's all based upon birth. So, you're king. And, isn't this great? You're finally the king. Finally, you've gotten out of the shadow of your father, who has been king and your father for so long. You had to witness him being seemingly an effective king. The people loved your father, but you knew what he was really like. I mean, you knew what happened behind those closed doors. He was not a good person. And now, finally, you're the king. And you can finally do right things. Now, you unfortunately can't really deal with him. He's dead. You can't deal with your issues with him. But still, you can at least be a good king. But the people don't seem to see it, right? I mean, they still love him, and he's the one who's gone now. They look back fondly on the great things he did. They don't see you for what you're doing. You're actually being a better ruler, and they don't even see it. And meanwhile, you've got a son, that kid. I mean, look at him. I mean, he's just a lazy kid. He's going to be the next king. He's going to take my place. So finally, I'm the king, but now this kid is going to take my place, and he will be the king? This kid? This lazy, good-for-nothing kid? And oh, the population loves him too. They love my dad. They love the child, or the cute little child. I know what he's really like. He's just this lazy kid. And they love my father. They love him. And look at me. No one likes me. I'm the only good one here. And you can see immediately all of my patterns with my father, I start throwing onto my child. And these go on generation after generation after generation. So it's not quite the reincarnation model of last week, but it's potentially more chilling. It's not just that these patterns dominate our lives. Totally. It's that we pass them on generation after generation after generation. So how do you deal with this, what we would call the Oedipal conflict? Here's how they deal with it. You, then you're the ruler, and your son, and your deceased father, to whatever extent he takes part, and that's actually left as an open question. But let's begin with you and your son. You and your son walk to the edge of the ritual space, and you pause. And then you walk in without blushing. Now, that may seem like a ludicrously weird detail, but here's why. When you walk in, you're no longer you, and your son is no longer your son. You are now the son of your son. Your son is now your father, his grandfather, your deceased father. He, your son, walks onto the throne and sits down, facing south, the ritually proper place that the ruler faces. He, your son, but he's not your son anymore, he's your father, looks down at you. Looks down because you walk to the front of the throne, kneel down, looking up at him, your son, but he's not your son. And you will pay obeisance to him, your father, and your ruler, even though he's otherwise your son, but he's not anymore. And you have to act toward him, but now you're acting toward your father, as if you were a good son to him, and he has to act to you as if he were a good father to you. Probably when he was alive, that rarely occurred, but now it does. Except it's not him, it's your son. And your son, therefore, is learning from a young age what it means to be in the position of power, what it means to actually have that responsibility, as well as the dangers of the arrogance and power hungriness that can come with it. And you are forced yet again, after your father is finally left, to yet again be the submitted one, looking up at your father, except it's your son, and once again being in that position. Being forced in practice, not just to see that generational shift, but being forced to see that generational shift by being forced to replay it from the opposite perspective each playing the crucial role in this incredibly difficult relationship. You play the most difficult opposite role over and over and over again. Then, going back to this ritual, you stand up, you walk to the edge of the ritual space, you walk out. Now you're you, the sun is you, you can yell at your child again, all the old patterns repeat, and then you go back. And you're doing endless rituals like this all the time. Constant role reversals and shifts with everyone around you. That's the ritual. Now, let's take apart what they will say about this ritual. Needless to say, let's begin with the obvious point. You're not being socialized to be the person in the ritual, right? I mean, you're not trying to socialize your son to be your father. You're certainly not trying to socialize yourself to be the son of your son. You're doing this to be forced to see your patterns playing out in precisely the opposite way to allow a break to occur. You can begin to break these patterns, which of course leads to the obvious question, then what happens? So you're doing this, and let's imagine again, you're doing tons of these. Worlds in which, in a ritual, you are acting in a different way with those around you, becoming a different person over and over again. By definition, you're being forced to break your patterns, but why would this help? Here's why it helps. Because the argument is that what you are striving to do, in fact, what you're being forced to do early on, later you'll strive, now you're just being forced to do it. What you're being forced to do is to see in practice the degree to which you are a patterned creature and everyone else around you is. You are being forced to see the degree to which not only you are patterned and not only they are patterned, but the degree to which you perceive the world as being the stable world where things really are what their patterns make them to be. And you are being forced in practice to break out of that. If you do this, what you are trying to gain a sense is what Confucius will call humaneness, otherwise sometimes translated benevolence. This is the term I mentioned in passing before, in which disciples will say, what do you mean by this? What does this mean? And it'll give you endlessly different examples and endlessly different definitions. But to get a sense of it, once you're looking at what's going on outside the ritual, here's what I think they're really getting at. What humaneness is an ability to actually begin to see those around you, and as we will see momentarily, the entire world around you, as, in fact, incredibly messy, utterly capricious, not at all ordered outside of the patterns that we fall into that define it, define us and define it. And once you begin to see that, what you are being trained to do is to begin to see, or to sense in that messiness, how the little things you're doing, the patterns you fall into, are affecting those around you all the time in ways you never even sense. It's affecting them in ways that are often counterintuitive because they're just responding by their patterns. And you're slowly becoming able to work with that. You slowly start to be able to sense how, when you use a certain tone of voice and act in a certain way, earlier by rote pattern, it brings out certain responses. It drags out these different energies. And you begin to learn how to alter that and shift that. You begin to sense how in a certain situation, the entire situation is dominated by a series of patterns of all the interactions going on. And you get better and better at sensing those patterns of interaction and sensing the little things you can do that can begin to alter it and shift it in a different way. To give, again, one of their examples. Here are examples of what Confucius is described as doing. There are endless ones of these, where Confucius will simply walk into a room, will so flawlessly sense all of the patterns going on around him that he will simply do something. He'll use a tone of voice. He'll quote a line of poetry. He'll make a gesture. He'll just do something that will alter that situation for the better. For the better, now, you're beginning to get a sense, meaning, for the better meaning that at doing something in which people begin to actually relate to each other. Not, in other words, by rote pattern, but really begin to relate to each other. The ideal is a world in which humans would be able to truly begin to flourish in their relationships with each other. World of relationships, in other words, not based upon pattern, but based upon resonance, in which people are altering each other and working with each other and growing from each other. That's the world you're aiming at. In other words, when Confucius is described as doing these little gestures, the sense is he's doing the equivalent of a ritual when there's no ritual telling him what to do. Early on, we just do rituals because we need to. We're breaking our patterns. Do the rituals. You have to submit yourself to the rituals. You must be that person that you're supposed to be in that ritual. The goal is you reach a point, and this is what Confucius is seen as having achieved by the end of his life when he's described in the Analects, at being so intuitively good at this that he can simply talk to a disciple, sense what to say to a disciple, seeing, in other words, the patterns that disciple's falling into, and sensing what to do to help that disciple in that situation. Or in the larger situations I was mentioning, what to do to affect the interactions of those around him. Or, at a larger level, what to do to affect the larger socio-political patterns that are holding people back. That's the goal of the ritual training. That's the goal of humaneness. So suppose one were to achieve this, or looking at Confucius when he did, what would this mean in terms of its implications? What it means, first of all, and most obviously, but it's important to note it clearly, what it means is an ability to see the world as radically other than the way we normally perceive it. That we dangerously perceive the world around us to be stable, to be composed of people with their own distinct personalities, and a relatively stable world, and you are being forced to see that that stable world is a creation of patterns that are almost always going to be, at some level, viciously dangerous to everyone in the long run in terms of how they play out. And you are being trained, forced at the beginning, but then training yourself as you become better at doing it, to not see the world that way and to begin to sense how to alter the world. The argument, therefore, is a very intriguing one in terms of where this takes us. Note, instead of a radical view that the way to change the world in, say, the Axial Age or in our own, is by coming up with a grand vision that we then try to impose on the world. Or a vision that I, with my individual will try to alter the world directly according to my will. Or even, as we saw last week, in a vision that at the beginning point seems to share some similarities, but then goes in a radically different direction, the vision we saw last week, where your goal is to break all of your attachments, break the self, as an attempt to gain absolute universal compassion for all living creatures. Note the argument that Confucius has given. It is an argument that says all of the work of doing extraordinary things begins at the most common, mundane aspects of your everyday life. It actually begins with the common, seemingly absurdly mundane ways you perceive the world, interact with those around you. That's where it all begins. That's where your patterns set in from a young age with your family, and later your friends, and it is where the work of breaking these patterns begins. It also argues that even if you begin at the most ludicrously common mundane level, what you are capable of doing in the long run can be extraordinarily greater than any vision of imposing your will on the world, because a vision of a will from this point of view is simply going to be playing out your patterns and will be responded to by others around you with their patterns, which means why, from this way of reading, so many of the grand socio-political revolutions of the world fail, because you can change at some kind of grand level, but you don't change the everyday stuff, which means people's patterns just can go straight along, unchanged. You begin there. And note also some other implications, powerful and yet some will disturb us, and let's lay them all out. Note also what this means in terms of changing the world. it's beginning, as we mentioned, at a very common and mundane level. Note, although I said it goes beyond that in terms of its sort of grandness, because the goal is to change this larger socio-political world too, note it doesn't go beyond it in a different sense. Because note here that the vision is not that there was some golden age in some distant antiquity, not that there's going to be hopefully some distant utopia a few millennia hence. Note the vision here is if we're going to create a better world, we do it right here, right now, in the most common aspects of our everyday life. And if we can do it, what we will create are pockets. And the argument is this has happened repeatedly in human history. Sort of pockets at either a small level or a larger level where people really begin to flourish. And then sadly, they tend to kind of die out because people return to their patterns. And then hopefully, it will begin again. And the vision is Confucius clearly sees himself in a period of incredibly dangerous times. He openly says, we could change the world completely and make an extraordinary world. But there's a tragic sense, too, because that will never be long-lasting. There's no everlasting utopia. And then patterns will set in again. Note also there are no universal guidelines that you could ever follow as to what a better world would be, apart from these sort of general senses of people resonating with each other and really relating to each other. Because what the given patterns in a given society are that are so dangerous are something that, by definition, we will have an incredibly difficult time of doing. And people doing the practices being called upon will, by definition, see different patterns, because they are different patterns, and will need to do different things. And so you can't even say, well, Confucius's socio-political vision involved the following when he gets involved in social acts, and therefore, if we want to follow his teachings, we do the same thing. Because by definition, if you're worried about the incredibly dangerous patterns playing out in, say, the American empire right now, you would do radically different things, because it's a radically different set of problems that he would have been trying to deal with in the state of Lu 2,500 years ago. There are no universal guidelines. None. And note, too, another implication, which is that if a great world is something we could create here and now, beginning with the most mundane aspects of our daily lives and hopefully beginning to create a world where we can really flourish, if that is the case, note, and we've already kind of hinted at this, but it's important to make it very clear, why you would have in the Confucian tradition this incredible cynicism, skepticism, I think would even be the better word, with grand revolutionary projects that try to change the world in some kind of according to some kind of radical vision. So if you look at, as we mentioned briefly last week, the great isms, socialism, communism, capitalism, attempts to radically create a new totalizing order based upon a definition of what human nature is and trying to create an entire worldview accordingly. Movements like that, we think of these as exclusively modern. They're certainly not. There have been ism movements like this, these totalizing movements throughout world history. Confucians tend to be deeply skeptical of them. They would say, you try to define the entire world according to a vision of human nature. What you're really doing is taking one set of patterns humans tend to fall into and creating a world so totalizing, they de facto will just stay in those patterns forever. Which, of course, from this point of view, is the last, absolutely last thing you will ever want to do. So in practice, what, for example, does political theory and economic theory look like in the Confucian tradition? It's always kind of operating at that next level. So what I mean by that is the following. Imagine a Confucian critique of, say, rational choice theory right now. So the claim of a rational choice theory is, we will study human beings. We will see that human beings are these rational actors who make decisions based upon their rational interest, and we will try to build an entire world, beginning with the marketplace, but hopefully ideally everything, the political sphere, the educational sphere, everything, that operates by market principles in which individuals are always acting according to their self-interest. From a Confucian perspective, the argument is not that you can't do that, it's that dangerously you can, except note what you're doing. You're not accurately seeing what human beings are like. You're taking a possible set of patterns humans can fall into, and then you're constructing a world such that that does become the patterns humans fall into, and then you actually construct a world in which that becomes so totalizing that you create humans who actually are like that. So it's not that you can't create it, it's that you can, which is incredibly dangerous. And so the critique is always, look at the sets of patterns being created by socio-political institutions, try to sense their dangers, and sense how to alter them. And it's always that next level. Like, you'll never find a Confucian discussion in its entire history that will say, be the equivalent of a rational choice economic theory, or behavioral theory, or what have you. It's always, let's look at the current set of patterns, see their dangers, and see how to alter them. This is part of its power. It's also, of course, something that people oftentimes find maddening from a comparative perspective, because they want to say, OK, what's the ism of Confucianism? To go back to your earlier question from last week, like, how would we create a perfect Confucian society? It misses the point, because the whole argument is what that would mean in any given situation and in any larger socio-political order is, by definition, not going to be answerable. Now, let me then turn to tendencies in the tradition, because that's going to be important too. Now, my last way of sentence, that last sentence, may be slightly misleading, because it might imply it's kind of an anything-goes philosophy. Not at all. I mean, if you're committed to a view that you want to create a world where people are actually interacting, what it will mean is there'll be certain kind of pushes in the tradition. Those pushes will aim toward the following things. There tends to be, well, obviously, an incredibly strong emphasis on ritual training, not surprisingly. Equally importantly, and seeing as kind of the same thing, an incredibly strong push toward education. So education is the means by which we break these patterns. An incredibly strong push toward meritocracy. In other words, absolute opposition to a world in which positions are defined by birth. The goal is rather to, when you're in a society where positions are defined by birth, by the way, we're living in one, when that's the case, how do you break that to create a world where, as much as possible, people with education are able to break the patterns, and as much as possible, you want a world where those who are cultivating themselves, becoming more humane, achieve ever greater levels of leadership, because they're the ones that, number one, you want to have to be in leadership positions, and they're the ones who then can inspire that next generation to do the same. So a very strong push toward meritocracy. Also note a very strong push against, we sort of noted this, but it's worth delving on a bit further, any kind of a totalizing vision that would define you in a certain way. So let me just give a standard example that would be very important in the tradition. They will say, imagine, or note, this is not even imagine, it's an empirical fact, they would say, note the degree to which, over the course of your daily life, you are endlessly performing different roles. Endlessly, right? So you're a student, you're a friend, you're a teacher, you're an employer, you're an employee, and you're constantly playing these different roles. Oftentimes, we will correctly ask, how do I play this role effectively? But of course, it's also the case that these roles are almost always going to be conflicting with each other at various times throughout the day, and certainly over the course of a lifetime. This should be seen as a good thing. What you don't want is a society in which you are a thing, because if you're a thing, you will tend to fall into the patterns associated with that one thing. And so they would say, focus on the fact that you have several of these roles. Focus on the fact that they conflict. That can actually be a healthy thing in terms of the cultivation process, because it's endlessly forcing you to not think in terms of, I should do X because I'm supposed to do X. It's forcing you to think, in this moment, I am told to do X. In that moment, I'm told to do Y. In this moment, according to conflicting roles, I'm told to do X and Y. And that forces you to simply sense the situation and act appropriately. That's the goal. Again, absurdly mundane examples, but the point is, that's where the work begins. It's always trying to get you to sense situations, sense the complexity of situations, and see how to act and alter those situations. And let me just conclude with a very brief comparison and contrast with what we discussed last week. Pieces of this actually are intriguingly, surprisingly similar to Buddhism. As we saw, the opening move of Buddhism, it's a slightly different terminology, but the opening move is very similar. That our danger as humans is the degree to which we are just entrapped in this world of patterns that we never see. In both cases, the goal is to alter these patterns and break us out of the patterns that we have become so natural to us, so ingrained in us, that we don't even see them. But note the radical difference. If that's the similarity that both traditions are so deeply concerned with, the Buddhist move, the radical move of breaking attachments, ideally fully breaking attachments, ideally truly leaving society, leaving your family, breaking all attachments, the discipline required to do so, such that you can then come back and truly alter the world with no attachments whatsoever, with fully compassionate love. In the Confucian tradition, and it touches on a key question you asked last week, Cornell, the Confucian tradition is, no, you don't leave any of this. You must stay in it. You absolutely, you stay in that family. With all of the horrors and difficult dynamics of a family, by definition, you stay in that family, and it's the work there, beginning, that you begin to make the changes. With friends, you begin there. And then the word they will often use is extension. You are developing the ability to work with these patterns, to see the dangers of these patterns we fall into at the very mundane levels, family, immediate friends at a young age, and then you start extending that. And slowly the goal is to achieve a point where you can actually begin to affect things at the larger socio-political level. But you never leave the family, you never leave society, you must stay in it. And the way that you'll get the equivalent of what the Buddhists will talk about, that kind of radical break they want, for the Confucians, that's what ritual does. It's ritual that does it. Ritual is what gives you that break from your everyday way of being in the world. That's where you get it. But the key with the ritual, again, is you're just there for a brief time, and then you have to go back. You're your son, you're the son of your son, but then you return, and suddenly you're the dad again. And it's that constant shift of roles that they care about. So you never leave society. You're in it, but you're being forced to play different roles, different social positions, become a different person, interact in a slightly different way. And it's that endless work that will actually make you change. And so let me just conclude with the Analects itself, which I suspect, again, was at first reading a tough text to get through. Having read it many times, I will happily say I do consider it one of the truly great philosophical works. But the reason it's written as it's written is, I think, for this purpose. If it tried to simply give you a doctrinaire position, laying out Confucianism, the danger is, going back to your earlier question last week, we'd think of it as an ism, and we'd miss it. I think the goal of the Analects is to try to simply give us a portrait of someone, Confucius himself, obviously, in practice doing this. And the goal of the text is that you're supposed to read it and reread it and reread it. You're supposed to become attuned to the ways he's working with people, the ways he's interacting with disciples, not because you can do the same thing. You're not interacting with the same disciples or in the same social situation. You're trying to learn how a figure seen as the master of this does it. And in practice, therefore, it's teaching us what would be possible were we to do the same. Where were we to submit ourselves to ritual in this sense of the term? Were we to devote our lives to trying in every situation to trying to affect those around us to the greatest degree possible? And the argument is, were we to do this over a course of a lifetime, you begin to achieve what Confucius was able to achieve, which is an ability to truly transform the worlds of those around him at both an immediate level and a much grander level, now many generations removed, and that is the goal of a life. It's an extraordinary vision that's saying you can become an extraordinary figure, but you do it through the most common, mundane, daily aspects of your life. And note, it ends in the same way for all of us. Either way, you do this or you don't, you die. There is no sense as to what awaits us after our death. There is no sense that we will go to a heaven or a hell or have a better or less birth accordingly. And that's part of the power of it. Not saying that won't happen, saying we have no idea. And so part of the power is it all comes down to how we live our daily lives, how we affect those around us, and that's it. That's it. We either do it well, affect those around us for the better, do it really well, and perhaps can even have an effect for generations to come, allowing those around us to flourish as well as the generations to come to flourish, or we fail. Either way we die. As far as we know, there is no divine reward. It's simply that. It's an incredibly powerful philosophy because it intentionally prevents any kind of larger guidelines, any kind of larger ism, any kind of larger vision of divinity or a stable cosmos. It all comes down to the daily stuff of how we live our lives. But live it well, the argument is, and you can actually create radically new selves, a radically better world, and leave that for the generations to come, or we'll fail. It's an extraordinarily powerful philosophy, and going back to the way I began, yes, I think it is very deeply worth taking seriously. It is one of the truly great world philosophies, very counterintuitive when you get into the details, and yet, in terms of its ultimate implications about what we would do on a daily basis, extraordinarily powerful. Thank you so much.
Michael, let me ask a question of interpretation,
Yes.
or a series of connected questions of interpretation, beginning with one of your last statements. Transforming the world around you.
Yes.
So the question is, transforming the world around you to what end?
Yes,
Now,
absolutely.
there are two interpretations of your argument about patterns. So on one interpretation of your analysis of the teachings of Confucius, the problem with the patterns is that they're the wrong patterns. Or in other words, there are better patterns or worse patterns, and then we need some standard, some criterion by which to distinguish the ascent of the patterns. The alternative interpretation is that the problem with the patterns is that they're patterns.
Yeah, no, that's the problem.
And that the alternative is an experience that is unpatterned. And then we need some elucidation
Yes.
of the content and structure of this life without patterns.
Yes.
So on either of those interpretations, the view that there are patterns that are higher than other patterns, or the view that patterns are intrinsically bad and that the best is to be without patterns, there's a horizon in this discourse. So you focused on the negative, on the critique of the patterns, the bad patterns, or the patterns as opposed to no patterns. But there's something on the other side, which is the objective. And presumably what's on the other side is a view of interpersonal connections.
Yes.
The personal is what is sacred, and the relations among people,
Right.
and they are the star that guides us, and that we must somehow liberate from these patterns or from the bad patterns. But then we need to hear more about the content of intersubjectivity, because it's as if the discourse you presented were just a diagnostic or negative discourse, but not a discourse about the vision of this interpersonal life on the other side, which is then the goal for the sake of which we would transform the world around us.
But
so
in
let
the
me
text
please.
itself, though,
Yeah.
you got to stress on integrity. Stand by your word. Stand by your word. Stand by. How many times you say that over and over and over again?
Absolutely.
And also you've got the moral universalism that says quite explicitly, a version of the golden rule, never impose on others that you do not want imposed on you. So that's a certain moral spiritual content to a certain kind of witness to be born that is an alternative to the patterns, for the most part, pejorative and negative in that way.
Absolutely.
But it's still pretty bleak.
So it's an ideal of reciprocity. But the ideal of reciprocity is just a fragmentary element in this conception of intersubjectivity. It's not enough to compose a conception. And that's what I want to hear more about.
Reciprocity. Integrity is not reduced
Yes,
to
of course.
reciprocity. integrity has something to do far beyond mutuality and reciprocity. It has to do with how you act in your life, regardless of whether others treat you this way or that, without any kind of heavenly reward in this case.
But guided by some conception of being attuned to the others.
Yes.
And being
Yeah,
able to
absolutely.
imagine
That's
the
true.
otherness of the otherness.
That's true.
So
That's
all of
true.
that begins to give some flesh
Yeah.
to this idea of
Absolutely.
intersubjectivity.
Yes.
But
Absolutely.
that's what I'm calling the horizon in your argument,
Yes.
which remains inexplicit.
Yes.
But failure is
Yep.
built in. It's like Samuel
Oh,
Beckett.
absolutely.
Try again, fail again, fail better. Try again, fail again, fail
Yeah,
better.
oh, absolutely.
Failure is built in, intrinsic to the alternative, because the world is
Absolutely.
such a mess that
Absolutely.
the only thing that can liberate, it reminds you a lot of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound.
Fascinating.
When
Fascinating.
Eliot says modern world has de-ritualized life, it's all marketized,
Yeah.
and the only escape are the thin rituals that no longer can transform us. Pound went to Confucianism. Eliot went to Buddhism for a while, then became a
Exactly.
Christian.
Indeed.
But a
Indeed.
right-wing anti-Semitic royalist
Indeed.
Christian, which is
Indeed.
sad. But I mean, but that's his way of dealing with the
Yeah.
mess, the ugliness of
Yes.
what is, because he cannot come up with a
Yes.
moral and spiritual content. I'm just using two
Yeah,
Americans in this case,
absolutely.
who are modern
No.
poets. But
Yes.
but
Now, just before you answer on this, Michael,
I'm answering for the brother.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Much better like that.
I want to introduce a second line of questioning.
Absolutely.
Because the two lines of questioning are related.
Absolutely.
So the second line of questioning is the extent to which this view of the elevation of interpersonal relations is superimposed on the pre-existing template of the organization of social life.
Right.
In other words, it is a humanization or a spiritualization of the established social order, and the extent to which it requires a radical transformation of this order. That's a vital ambiguity.
Yes,
and
I agree.
there are certain aspects in this view, like the theme of meritocracy,
Yes.
which suggests a transformation,
Absolutely.
but a very partial transformation, because that is also only a fragment. We know from the contemporary societies that a meritocratic principle can be advanced with relatively little transformation of the rest of the economic and political structure, married, for example, to the hierarchies of a class society. So is this not also another fundamental ambiguity in this view, that the extent to which it takes the established order as a template is not clear?
Yeah, they are indeed related. So let me begin with the first question
Yes.
and turn to the second, which follows directly. And to begin with the first question, let me give you some of their examples. Beginning with Confucius, who's the prime example for this. The descriptions of him, and you've seen this in the Analects, are counterintuitive to a lot of our stereotypes. Like we tend to think of him as this ritual fuddy-duddy who's always doing rituals. Actually, in most of the Analects, he's seen as someone who's, again, moved beyond rituals. Like he's spent his life doing rituals, but he's now achieved the state of humaneness. And the way he is described, and here's a term that pops up constantly, and I think it's going to be very telling for the vision here, he's joyous. It's a term that's used constantly. Like he's described as this figure who's just intensely joyous. The disciples always kind of want to be around him because there's this incredible joyous charisma about him. When you're around him, you feel this just incredible joy. And the sense here isn't just that he's happy. I think it's joy in a much deeper sense. And I'll give you the Chinese term momentarily to give you a sense of this. But first, with these stories, it's joy in a deeper sense because the sense is if things are really relating to each other, there's this incredible joy that comes from those relations. In other words, when we are in our normal lives not really relating to those around us, that's where comes what we tend to associate as the horrors of the human condition. The sense is, if you have even a flashing moment where you're really sensing the world around you, sensing people around you, relating to those around you, it's the sense of joyousness. Now, I mentioned I'd touch on the Chinese term here. It's the same word, by the way, as music. And this is why musical terminology is so important in the Confucian tradition. So think of music as there's a world out there of sounds. in music, you take those sounds and they resonate, right? And in the way they resonate, they affect everyone spontaneously. And the vision is, imagine social worlds where it's like music, right? It's the music of and the joyousness that comes from true resonance. And this is why also they'll even describe the self-cultivation process this way. They'll say, well, think of the ritual process aiming toward humaneness is like learning a musical instrument, right? You spend years training yourself, and you're being forced, you submit yourself, to the work of disciplining yourself to say, to use a modern instrument, to learn a piano. You spend a decade at least, doing these rote acts over and over and over again. But yet the reason you're doing it is to achieve an ability after, say, a decade or 2 decades where you can just sense the music, right? You're no longer thinking about it. You're sensing it. You're able to shift the music. You're able to shift the mood of a room by the way you can sort of sense the patterns, alter the way you're playing a piece a little harder, a little softer. And that's what you're aiming for. Now, that seems like a mild way of answering it, but yet the reason I want to begin with the mundane level is that I think that's the way this tradition operates. So if you think of that as your goal, again, beginning at this mundane level, kind of the joyousness of true interaction, then they want to say, what would that mean if you're expanding it? Like, what would it mean if you tried to achieve this at a larger level? Now, little gestures are not going to immediately change the socio-political world. And so the argument is, what you're aiming to do is create a world as much as possible where each generation is both inspired to and institutionally kind of forced to do the work of training and education. And your goal is to, as much as possible, create such a world. This leads to, and I'm sort of halfway between your first and second question here, this is why you get this push toward things like meritocracy. The idea is, as much as possible, you would want a fluid world, fluid in the specific sense of based upon education and training, where figures ideally like a Confucius are going to be there to inspire you, and inspiring as much as possible that next generation. And finally, then pushing toward the heart of the second question, in terms of the degrees to which this can lead to radical social transformation. I'll give both the positive and perhaps from our point of view negative position, but we should take both seriously. The positive would be to say, let's look historically at how this is played out. And I think one can make an argument, in fact, I will happily make the argument, that if in world history, if you're looking at the ways in which entrenched power structures based purely upon birth have been altered and affected. Sadly, it's a kind of a sad history in terms of the degrees to which we've effectively done that. But certainly pre-19th century, I would argue, one of the most effective were the meritocratic institutions created by Confucians. I mean, the goal of this was to create a world in which, as much as possible, positions of political power, I say as much as possible because they can never get rid of the hereditary monarchy, despite their endless attempts, but with that very important exception, all positions of power were based exclusively upon education and training, not based upon birth. And they had incredibly elaborate institutional means to try to prevent a world where, say, the hereditary class could simply educate their children to immediately gain position. And so you do endless work to try to create a divorce between hereditary power and political power, the latter as much as possible being, minus hereditary monarchy, being based upon meritocratic techniques. Now, so I would say, can this lead to radical transformation? I think historically, absolutely yes. But let me also get to the other side of the question, which is important to wrestle with too, and it touches on what I was mentioning before as well. They will argue, and it's absolutely true, we're born into a world, and you begin to work with the world you're born into. They will absolutely say that. So we don't invent bunches of rituals, right? I mean, we are born into a world. Many of those rituals may be horrible rituals. Confucius is clearly presented as someone who's telling disciples, don't do that ritual, don't do that ritual. Mencius is an even more extreme example. It's constantly, God, don't do that ritual, that's a horrible ritual. So you're achieving a point where you can break rituals, alter rituals, help develop better rituals for the next generation. But you're born into a world with rituals, and that's where you begin. And so
Until
yes.
you make a revolution, like the
Exactly.
revolutionaries of the two Chinese revolutions
Yeah,
of the Chinese of the 20th century.
Yes, and this is the key thing to wrestle with Confucianism, I think. It's can it lead to radical transformation? I think the answer is historically, absolutely. And yet they are also very skeptical of new totalizing ideologies. They will say, you begin with the world you're born into and you work from that. Which means, yes, by definition.
Anti-utopian sensibility built in based on the skepticism of revolution. But Brother Roberto's point about the ways in which meritocratic institutions can go hand in hand
no question.
with class hierarchy, imperial hierarchy, homophobic, transphobic, racial hierarchy. But then,
no question.
You think of this week, though. Think of this week right now. This is March Madness, right? That's a ritual of the capitalist civilization of the American Empire. Every year. And it's serious. I saw it the other day in the restaurant. It was interesting. Saw a slight Kansas and somebody playing, but it was interesting. But the thing is that if rituals are inescapable, weddings, funerals, Super Bowls, March Madness, and yet these same rituals reinforce the old patterns you're talking about. So we got to have rituals capital R versus rituals small r. The capital R is a transformative one.
Indeed.
The small r reproduces the same hierarchy over and over. Now we've talked about this in regard to Mardi Gras. Which is another ritual of liminality. The world turns upside down, the king becomes the pauper becomes the queen. Straights become gay and lesbian and trans and so forth for 3 days. Then it's over. Now, something else is going on this week, which is Holy Week, right? Now, isn't it the case that whatever transformation comes out of the Confucian view, let's imagine a left-wing follower of Confucius who's read Marx, Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde. So that you got a critique of empire, you got a critique of capitalism, you got a critique. But it's leading toward Good Friday. It's going to be crucified. Is that fair?
Fascinating.
It's going to be crucified.
Fascinating.
Because the powers that be are such, they're only going to allow capital R ritual to generate so much transformation. And when it becomes too radical, here comes the police. Here comes the army. Here comes the ruling class institution of higher learning.
Absolutely.
That's telling the students, you all better not be too utopian, or that's a sign of your adolescent sensibility. Grow up and adjust to the hierarchy, because it's the best that you can do in the short life that you have. And that's a dominant message at Harvard.
Indeed.
Not the only one, but it's a dominant one.
Very much so.
So what do you do with that?
Both outstanding points. Let me begin with the first, which goes directly to the second. So, yes, the distinction you're making between ritual capital R and ritual small r, the distinction they'll make along the exact same lines is they will say much of what we would tend to call rituals, or what they at the time called rituals too, but they would classify ours the same way, are what they call conventions or customs. For those who know Chinese, it's su, feng shui to su. Those are simply su. And the key with those, they're conventions and customs, meaning things that we're simply born into that we just repeat. In other words, they just become more patterns. And they absolutely serve to reinforce larger social forms of domination. That's what conventions and customs are. And then the idea is you're trying to make those su into rituals. So in the example of the father-son role reversal I mentioned, you can actually trace this. So earlier, that actually was what the Confucians, before Confucians, would call a convention. So it was literally simply an ancestor worship, where you try to pay filial respect to your deceased ancestors. And then it's the Confucians who then came in and actually made this role reversal out of it. So they took a convention and make it into a ritual. Now, that only heightens the point you raise later, because by doing that, couldn't that over time help to reinforce other forms of social domination that we're missing, right? Like it's clearly aimed at a certain form of, the Oedipal conflict that they want to work on. Surely there are other implications of this ritual that would lead to other forms of domination. Absolutely. And that's why that work never ends. And then getting to your key point, even if we do this, aren't you dealing with authorities, from political figures to nowadays Google advertisers or Facebook advertisers who are so good at seeing our patterns? The answer is yes. And so your hope in this is you're trying to train people who not simply can stand up to authority, but who can actually undermine authority with all that it takes to do that. And they give all of these examples. I've been mentioning examples of Confucius. Examples, too, just are pervasive in the Confucian tradition of what do you do if you're a minister in what you perceive to be a horrible, horrible social world being controlled by a horrible hereditary monarch. And it gives you all of these examples, none of which are guides that we could actually follow, but trying to give you examples of people like Confucius dealing with his disciples, but in this case, figures trying to wrestle with forms of authority. And what's intriguing about the stories is all of them come down to figures in certain situations who are able to sense how certain traditions had become so embedded in new forms of domination people weren't catching, and they were able to, again, do these little things to alter them. They can be everything from using very subtle ways of persuasion to convince the monarch. It can involve leaving the government and forming revolutionary movements. It can involve trying to alter some of these conventions and make them into rituals, the small r ritual, big R rituals in your terminology. And so the idea is, think of your life as being, think of you as being required throughout your entire life to do this all the time. Like even if you think you've succeeded in getting some really good rituals with a capital R, no, you haven't, because those will just become embedded in yet more, and yet potentially even more insidious, dangerous patterns, and you have to work to fix those. And so it's never ending. And going back to your earlier point too, it's never ending, and you're always failing. Like everything you do that seems to be a success is likely to create yet more dangerous patterns that you need to work against. And it seems like a horrible vision of a life, just endless work and then you die. And yet the flip side of that is it says it's out of that that can come extraordinary possibilities. It's
and joy.
That endless work.
And joy.
And that's the key word.
Yeah, exactly. The joy that's internal in the witness itself.
Joy. Absolutely.
It's not reducible to just a consequence.
Indeed. Absolutely.
It's not utilitarian. It's not consequential.
That's beautifully put.
Absolutely. Existential joy.
Yeah.
Question.
Yes, indeed. Let's open this up.
Dear sister right here.
So I guess that in terms of the picture of the self was describing, that is the picture of the world.
Yes.
So since there is no good in abstract way, or no a priori values to transcend time, there is no particular good, at least independent of a particular time for the self. But how can we define, further in the discussion before, what is good or not, and how for the world, for the self, and what's the vision that we are actually aiming at? Because I guess he mentioned some sort of principles. I mean, meritocracy, the value of education.
Absolutely.
Which actually transcend time because they appear to be able to transform the power structures of the past and the present. So I guess there are some values which transcend time, even according to this very theory that actually reject them. So what about that?
Yeah, beautifully put. And I even like your terminology here. It's a nice way of putting it. The pushes in the tradition are those. And so they're not reducible to an ism, but you're absolutely right. It's a push toward training, education, meritocracy, self-cultivation, a push toward, and then in terms of the terminology of where you're going, again, resonance, joy. And so those are the pushes. But what you get an absolute refusal to give you, as you were mentioning in the first part, beautifully put, is any guiding message of what that will mean. And even, for example, note the way in both the Analects and in Mencius, the way heaven is described. So heaven is the high deity. In the earlier Bronze Age religion, heaven was always a moral deity, depending on your definition of morality, but a moral deity supporting what were defined as good rulers who could effectively maintain society. So heaven would give a mandate to a good ruler and withdraw it from a bad ruler. But it also meant heaven was also supporting the hierarchy of an hereditary monarch and the aristocrats underneath. And note in both the Analects and the Mencius, heaven is incredibly capricious. and I think that's important. The argument isn't metaphysically heaven isn't moral. That's definitely not there. I mean, heaven at times seems to do great things. Heaven at other times seems to do just horrible things. Confucius' best disciple dies young, tragically. And it's this poignant moment where the figure Confucius thinks really could change the world, much more than he himself. Just this incredible figure who's so far along the path of self-cultivation that he's really, really going to do something extraordinary. Perhaps not be the political failure Confucius was, but really be politically able to do what Confucius only dreamed he might be able to do. And he tragically dies young. And the response isn't, oh, I guess he wasn't so good after all, like heaven clearly had to punish him for things I didn't see him doing. No, the sense is he looks up to heaven and screams, heaven, you're destroying us. Why are you doing this? Period. Like, in other words, he's horrified, he's distraught, and yet for him, there's no way to read a larger moral message. It's not that he had to die for some larger purpose. It's that heaven will do things that are just weird to us. Mencius is even stronger on this. He's constantly attacking heaven, saying, why did you do this? Why did you give us hereditary monarchy? Why are you blocking this? Why? And the sense is, and I think it's important to the ethics of Confucianism, it's a capricious world. Like if we think it's a morally clear world where there's a moral deity always rewarding the good and punishing the bad, we'll fall into modes of thinking there's a clear good and there's a clear bad. And it's important, they want to say, it's a capricious world, and even heaven is not going to give you guidelines, which only underlines the second part of your point. It's all about the training to see the complexity of patterns playing out and how to work on them.
But there's no contradiction in these views, right? So it seems that there are two ideas here. One idea is the cosmos is meaningless.
Yes.
And is indifferent to our human concerns.
Yes.
But within this meaningless world, we create meaning.
Absolutely.
We create this little space of light, which is the space of humanity.
Absolutely.
Then comes the second idea on your question of the supreme good.
Yeah.
The supreme good is social union. That is a form of mutual recognition and reconciliation that is not instrumental.
Yes. Yes.
In Kant's language of the others as ends in themselves. And that experience of the interpersonal that is not instrumental is the source of joy.
Yes.
Going back to your question of joy. So
Absolutely.
these views are coherent.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
they fit together in a certain
Absolutely.
way. They leave open this crucial question of the social template.
Yeah.
And they contradict our modernist view that the highest form of personal experience may not be that of an integrated personality at rest, but rather a contradictory personality that lives under the shadow of groundlessness and mortality, remembering that shadow rather than forgetting it.
But it sounds like,
yes.
I am a multitude. I'm
Yeah.
thought through with
I'm a multitude,
contradictions
yes.
and incongruities.
Absolutely.
I'm resting on groundlessness.
Absolutely.
Let's have a good time.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's absolutely
Walt.
Walt.
That last
Absolutely.
But Chekhov
You're
is
multitude.
actually,
You're all multitudes.
Chekhov is closer. You remember that line in Chekhov's journal when he says, what matters most is to break out of the rut. Everything else is unimportant.
Fascinating.
The breakthrough. Will the three sisters make the breakthrough and get to Moscow?
Fascinating.
The utopian energies are uncontainable, but reality comes in, and at the end it's just, if only we knew. All we can do is move like inchworms. Curtis Mayfield's keep on pushing, step by step, stage by stage. That's all you have is your integrity and joy, but the worms are waiting for you. Now that's Anton. But Anton got a lot of love coming from Russian Orthodox tradition. Now we got our Russian brother here. Is that fair? Sure. No, well, share that with us and we'll see whether you're right or wrong. I'm just kidding. Go right ahead.
My reading of Chekhov
Yes.
is actually much closer to the philosophy of background but in being interested
Yes.
in temporality as such and in describing,
Yes.
although in a very intricate and subtle way, the structures that allow us to have a phenomenological unfolding of the world around us in which we always find ourselves immersed. So the Christian, or the dimension of Christian religiosity informing his psychological philosophical method, I take to be secondary. For me, Chekhov is a psychologist who has taken interest in the structure of human psyche.
Yes.
Is more secular. However conscious he truly is of the actual reasons behind that,
Right.
to explore and to pinpoint the structure of human psyche.
No, I think you're right about that, but let's push it just a little bit, just a little quick check-off moment. That the unbelievable empathy and love that flows through Chekhov, even as observer. It could be Lipa in the ravine, you know. It could be the mother of the bishop in that next to last short story. That love is secular, but it is so profound that it like Beckett, it helps sustain connection in space, in time, contingent, provisional, tentative, so that the second and third levels that you're talking about are connected. Is that a fair, Captain?
Father Cornell, here I'm still on the fence because it seems to me that Chekhov might be doing the exact same thing that Plato is doing. He himself may not be so optimistic, but yes, he shows that love, and this is something he wants to teach.
Yes.
But I think that at the same time, Chekhov's vision is much more bleak because he sees our dwelling in the symbolic as a problem for which may not be a solution.
Well, I don't think he has a solution at all. But it's love without optimism. All this just stamina, endurance, perseverance. That's all.
Perhaps, but I don't know which is his actual position. I still think.
Well, like Plato, he's holding it at arm's length. No, that's rich. No, I appreciate this Chekhov moment here. But it does relate to Buddhism, Confucius.
Indeed.
And
Absolutely.
especially Schopenhauer, who Chekhov was reading.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
He's a well-read medical doctor who writes some of the greatest plays and short stories known to the humankind. He's a blues man. Russian style. Questions, queries. Yes.
You mentioned earlier.
Speak up so we can all hear your voice.
You mentioned earlier about the push for America.
Yes.
But how do you define merit?
Yes.
This would have to be tightly linked with a conception of justice.
Yes.
But I cannot imagine a conception of justice that would not be patterned.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, great question and endlessly debated in the tradition. You're absolutely right. If you're pushing toward a meritocracy, and there were, one of the huge debates in the Confucian tradition is how do we define merit? And even more difficult, how would you actually create institutional means that would promote people based upon merit? Because you need to have some way to actually categorize it that would, as you can see immediately, would push against a lot of what Confucians would want to have to do. You won't be surprised here they didn't come up with a single solution after 2,000 years of wrestling. But what the debate is nonetheless telling of exactly what you're getting at. And so the concern was always you don't want to have merit defined in terms of things like, and some of this will be obvious and some less immediately obvious, ever defined in terms of what we could think of, mistakenly, as innate intelligence. They do not want it defined in terms of what we might think of as natural gifts and skills. They also, intriguingly, don't even want it defined in terms of things like stark intelligence. Because in all of those cases, the strong Confucian push is that all falls back on what we define as our natural gifts. Oh, I'm just born gifted at this, and we should have testing to try to find people who will actually be able to be in positions where they're good at being at what they're gifted at. So you're intentionally trying to work against that. And so what they were always doing is looking for means to try to test the degrees to which people are striving to become better people, better again, meaning better able to see the complexity of situations and work with them. So let me again just give a very concrete example. So when they start creating civil service exams, the idea being that any position of power, except minus the key one of hereditary monarchy that they can never get rid of, but every other position of power can only be achievable by taking the civil service exam. And so they will do things like the following. I'll just give two examples, but they're both very telling. In one example, you're given an impossible situation. So you're told, OK, you're an official. Here's the situation you're facing. And it's just this impossible situation where they describe the situation, all of its complexity, all the competing interests. And they say, write a memorandum with your argument as to what we should do. And because it's impossible, there's no right answer by definition. And what you're being tested on is twofold. The degree to which you're seeing the complexity and your ability to see something that could be done that could begin to open up something for the better, even though it won't solve it completely. And two, the degree to which you can write the memorandum in a way that would make that a convincing argument. A second thing you'd be asked to do, which is also very intriguing, is you'd be asked to write a poem. And it'll be on it, you'd be told, here's the situation, write a poem. And since the situation wouldn't be known in advance, you couldn't just write one in advance and memorize it. And what you're being tested on is not, are you a good poet? What you're being tested on is, in a situation that's being described, could you write a poem, literally on the spot, write a poem that would affect the mood of the reader in that situation? Because again, if you could do either of these two, ideally both, the idea is you must be someone who has trained themselves at least to the degree to which you can sense the complexity of a situation, sense what to do, and sense how to alter that situation for the better. Now, justice, you're right to ask the question. It's a sense of justice that's really saying, imagine justice as one in which if you get people like this in leadership positions, they will hopefully be the ones who will be able to give a very concrete example, look at sets of situations operating on the ground politically, socially, economically, and sense what can be done to alter those situations such that people could flourish to a greater degree. It's a very fascinating vision of what we as individuals can do, but also what sort of governmental practice would consist of. It's stark in its refusal to give easy answers to things like this. So yeah, great questions. Thank you. Yes.
Isn't it, I don't know, I perceive it this way, isn't it the following of detection of patterns to destroy them and to avoid a pattern in itself?
Yeah,
Isn't it paradoxical?
Yeah, no, it is, and I agree. Or even to put it slightly differently to underline your point, isn't it, paradoxical to say you break patterns by doing more patterns, which are rituals, and then putting it the way you put it, which is beautiful, isn't it paradoxical to say you're in essence using patterns to break patterns? And the answer is yes. It's like learning a musical instrument. You're never going to achieve the ability to improvise until you spent years and years and years doing the rote work of being forced to move your fingers, using the keyboard example, according to, you have to learn the tonal system, the chords, the chord progressions, and only then can you improvise, do atonal music, but you have to do that first. And this is the sense too. It's, you're being patterned in ways that will break your normal patterns, but, and this cuts to the key, you failed if you simply stick with those new patterns, right? Like learning a musical instrument, if you simply stop at being able to play, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, as it's read, you failed as a musician. You don't really achieve it until you can improvise. Same with learning a sport. And they would say, think of your daily life this way. You don't really learn it until you can actually sense situations and alter with the situation, and even better, alter the situation by the way you're acting. And so, yeah, you use patterns to break patterns, but your goal is to be able to improvise. Yes. And I would argue there's no other way to do it. Right? Like if we're patterned, you're not ever going to jump to the improvisation immediately. So to put that in stark terms, in America, I think we often think we can all be great individuals and improvise. And I think the response to the Confucian tradition is, minus rituals, you never improvise because you just repeat patterns. You think you're improvising, but you're just repeating patterns. You've got to spend those years learning learning the rote work of sitting at a keyboard before you can improvise. Yeah, so you need patterns to break them. So yeah, beautifully put, yes. Yes?
Yeah, so following up in the previous question, I was wondering regarding meritocracy, particularly when it comes to education and training.
Yes.
Why? Because the people who are usually obtaining this education and training, as Confucius was, are on the top layer of society. And this pattern is repeating over and over again. And since this is not democratized, like not all people have the access to these possibilities, it seems very unlikely that this pattern of meritocracy to what some people already have will help to remove that in the long run.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think beautifully put. And it goes back to the questions that both Cornell and Roberto have also asked in different ways of saying, well, I mean, isn't meritocracy always in danger of just recreating certain social hierarchies that just get replicated under the claim of merit? And the answer is absolutely. And so then when you look at the way that tradition wrestled with this, it's very telling. So and let me turn to education, which is just a beautiful example because it's something they're deeply concerned with, and obviously something we all, by definition, since we're in this classroom, are as well. So intriguingly, the tradition was always very wary of state-based education, which is very telling. Like you might think, based on what we've said, they would say, well, the state should just create massive educational systems. The Confucian tradition tended to be very nervous about that because they thought there's always a danger if the state's doing it, it will just be socializing people into certain ways of thinking. And so a lot of the great Confucian thinkers, in fact, the vast majority of them, were, if they weren't in the bureaucracy, they were teachers. So let me just give another example, a telling one. So the founder of what will later be called Neo-Confucianism, so this is a 12th century great Confucian master, his name is Zhu Xi. He was a teacher. And he was simply a local teacher like Confucius was, modeling himself directly on Confucius. And the reason was, he said, I don't want students going through a state-based system because I think the current state is actually horrible. I think it's a horrible system. It claims to be a meritocracy. It's not. It's simply bringing in aristocrats into power who then just replicate their own power. And so he formed local schools. And he himself was just a teacher. And the reason he would do that is to say, just like Confucius, unless we are actually actively trying to train people to really rethink the world in which they're living, you're going to get, indeed, under the claim of meritocracy, simply a replication of existing power hierarchies. And in that case, he, from an immediate point of view, was extraordinarily successful. So he actually overthrows the entire system that had by that point become entrenched. He successfully overthrew it. And one suspects, had he lived long enough to see the ultimate playing out of this, he would have realized about 150 years later, Neo-Confucianism had yet again become a very entrenched curriculum and desperately in need of other figures to break it. And so the sense is, yes, any system, even one that seems good, meritocracy, can always become entrenched. In fact, I'll take out Nate, will become entrenched in power structures, and you always need work against it. And one of the key ways Confucians always wanted to intervene was to say, let's constantly be educating new people outside of a state institutional system, because only in that way can we train people to work against this. So yeah, wonderful question. Thank you.
Question here, and then, oh, no, I think he had his hand up first, and then we'll move right. Yeah, go right ahead.
Early on in the Analects, Confucius uses the term the way or the path.
Yes.
How does this relate to this ideology of breaking patterns?
Yeah. So think of the way as, and the way it'll often be used in medical and in musical terminology, and it's directly related. Think of the way as twofold. And this will seem like a mixed metaphor, but that's the point. Think of it both ways. So think of the way as the way that is created by the ways we live our lives. Now, as you can see immediately by putting it that way, it will usually, from a Confucian perspective, be a bad thing. And in many Confucian texts, they'll say, think of way in the plural. And the different ways we live our lives can often be just these patterns we fall into. The good way, which is what's being used in the Analects, is to say, but imagine, on the contrary, the way in this musical terminology we're talking about. flawless resonance. And so what the way would be everything flawlessly interacting and growing and flourishing from that interaction. The joyousness that comes from flawless interaction. And the ways it'll be described are things like in those moments when I describe where you'll have just these joyous moments where Confucius will do something, the situation is altered, there's this sense of incredible joy. They'll say, yes, this is the way. And the sense is it's things flawlessly interacting. Yes, and therefore flourishing because of that interaction. Like, again, a perfect piece of music in which all the tones are brought together and become something radically other by their interaction. So it's flawless
the music is written and played by somebody.
Yes.
Here it looks like it's coming from somewhere else.
Precisely.
Where is it coming from?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, well, I think that's the sense. It's when we're doing this, it goes beyond what any one of us, including in this case Confucius himself, could have designed in advance. Like we grow through the interactions and become something other than, and if we're doing it right, better than we otherwise could have. So we to sort of push the metaphor, we in a sense form or even compose gorgeous pieces of music by the ways we live our lives, not because we plan out, oh, now I'm going to write sonata, the second movement of a sonata. We in the ways we enact it, we compose pieces of music that are created by the ways we live our lives. Yes. And if we try to pre-plan it, pre-design it, by definition, we won't, because we'll not
We've got
see
two more questions I saw here, and then one in the back, I think.
All right, my question, comment, curious what your thoughts are. You mentioned how it begins from a similar place that Buddhism does, but different projects.
Yes.
I'm curious why you think they ended up. One ends up with a more relational way of addressing this, as opposed to another, and what you have to say about that.
Yep.
And then my other question is.
Ooh, just one, my brother. Can you hold it, or is it just flowing so intense you got to let it out?
It's a quick question.
Okay, good.
The notion of using ritual to counteract ritual or patterns reminds me of some of the spiritual techniques or technology in systems of tantra. I think Buddhist tantra. Any similarity?
Oh, let's just have the last question.
Absolutely, yeah, take them all
Is
together.
that all
Yeah,
right?
of course,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I would just love an example of a current ritual that you think is really effective that's being played out in our world today.
Wonderful. So all great questions. I'll try to tie them together.
Absolutely.
So, but to begin with Confucianism and Buddhism, intriguingly, of course, Buddhism goes into China, so we can actually see the interaction, and there, I think you get some telling examples of the question you're asking. So the reason they mesh so well is because, as we've seen, the starting points are actually very similar. In Buddhism, it's worked out in terms of reincarnation, and in Confucianism, it's the sense of endless patterns that will continue for generations, but you can see the similarity and the similarity of concerns. Then when they interact, the big debate between them comes down to the question you mentioned. In the Buddhist tradition, the ultimate step, not that everyone will take it, but the ultimate step is absolute breaking of attachments, leaving the family, leaving society, disciplining yourself, and only then returning to change the world. In the Confucian sense, never, ever do that. You must stay in that, these horrible dynamics of the world and work with them. In radical difference, and when they debated things like, should someone physically leave a family, absolute opposition. Intriguingly, when it comes, this is going to play very well into your second question, when it comes to the performance of actual rituals, Buddhists and Confucians would often do it together. And the intriguing thing is they both saw correctly that they were out for something very, very similar. And for the Buddhists, it was the break required this extreme break. For the Confucian, it required sort of endlessly wrestling with the tensions. And yet, in the actual rituals, they would often physically do them together and would see something similar as happening. So let me give a very concrete example. Someone passes away. In the funeral rituals, Confucians and Buddhists would be together. And if you ask participants, are you a Confucian or a Buddhist, very rarely would someone be able to answer that question. Sometimes one would be one or the other, but usually you're just doing the ritual. And both wanted you to do the ritual. And the ritual would actually be very similar. And the result of this is, yes, you will find family rituals at a Confucian level and tantric rituals which we will define as differently, but if you look in practice at what they're doing, it's actually amazingly similar. Because again, despite these incredibly strong philosophical differences, there is a similar push that what you're working on is similar, and what you're ultimately even trying to gain is ultimately different, but in terms of practically what it means you're doing to get there is surprisingly similar. So yes, I agree. For all of the radical philosophical difference, there's a tremendous similarity in kind of the daily work to get there, minus, again, the one huge difference of do you physically leave society or do you physically not leave society? Leading directly to the final question and a wonderful way to wrap up today's session on. So if today we think we don't follow rituals, because we like to think we're looking within and being true to ourselves and good modern autonomous individuals, I think a Confucian plucked into the current world would say, not even remotely, we are not autonomous individuals in any manner, shape, or form. What we are ritual automatons, but of course, in their terminology, we're convention automatons. We just perform these social conventions. Mixed within these are all the ways we're manipulated now politically and through advertising techniques. And if you're looking for what they would want to say a ritual would be, what they would say is, imagine places where we could take these conventions and ritualize them. So, concrete example. If right now we have tons of people at Google and Facebook whose lives are devoted to tracing your patterns and selling those to advertisers, you could easily imagine, on the contrary, someone using that identical technology, if you're going into the field of computers and down the road, read your Confucius and think about this, couldn't you use that exact same technology to do the exact opposite, where we would actually, when we logged on, the work of the computer would be to break us from our standard ways of acting, to force interactions outside of the ones we usually interact with. Instead of being directed toward, oh, here's a person who matches my profile in place X around the world, suppose you're, on the contrary, connecting with people who don't match your profile. And you're actually intentionally taking this conventional patterned way and ritualizing it by being forced, if you log on to this website, you become, I'll use the terms, a different person interacting with those around you in a different way, breaking what you think of as what's me and what I like to do. You're taking a convention and making it into a ritual. That's doable. The problem isn't the technologies. It's we use them to pattern ourselves. Imagine if we used our same technologies to force us to break ourselves and move toward a world of improvisation. That's perfectly doable. We just don't. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. See you next week. Questions and comments. Oh,
Dialogue.
that was fantastic. Thank you.
See you tomorrow, brother. Yeah. Back to America. Oh, yeah. Oh, how depressing. No, it's nothing.
I was thinking about just oh yeah. Because I'm thinking that I got a message from you that was Chinese, but then it's a life. So yeah, we walked in, if you were still there, and I was like, oh, you didn't even have another drink. Oh yeah. It was in a good way. You're a good drink. You weren't drunk, but it was, but the reason I say lit, you were actually
I know, and now with you, yeah.
That was fun. I don't like the non-icing heroes. It's way more alcohol. It's the same glass. Yeah, it's 1 ounce of each. It's literally 1 ounce of each. You can't fuck it up. 1 ounce of each stir. Yeah.